Greetings, wonderful people. Great to have you with me. God bless you, everyone. Get ready to strap on the boots and walk with me along a primeval road to a place soaked in ancient history and dark emotions and light. Hopefully it's an offer and an invitation to contemplate more of the texture of what it is to be human and alive. Topics and experiences and feelings that maybe many people feel constrained from articulating. Anyway, I'm using ghosts and hauntings in this context very much as a primer to start a conversation. So, as I say, episode 16, this one is about a very famous, it's an overused word, but iconic chamber tombs, places of burial associated with the Neolithic in the deep southwest of England called Wayland's Smithy. But just before we venture into this incredible landscape, let me tell you please how you can help support the series. Go to patreon.com, that's what. Find me by name, sign up, part with some cash. You become a member of the family, which grants early access to all content and exclusive access to a weekly question and answer session, amongst other things. You ask the questions, I answer them, and nothing's off the table. The details, the address, it's all down there somewhere. Okay, join me. I think a lot of people feel that a sense of guilt, maybe, and that's not the only word, but a sense of guilt about what has happened to Britain well within the lifetime of somebody who's about my age, which is to say 58. I have said for a while in other places and on other platforms that I think Britain has been the target of a controlled demolition. I think what it is to be Britain and British has been dismantled down to the foundations. And I think even the foundations are being dug out and cast aside to leave nothing but a brownfield site ready for redevelopment as something else. You know, for the longest time, there will be a patch of dry land called, for cartographical purposes, the British Isles. But it's my contention that what it has been to be British for a long time is gone. And I think a lot of us are haunted by old Britain, the Britain of our childhoods, and certainly say the Britain of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents' childhood. So that's the wider tableau upon which I will begin to contemplate stories that are associated with the site of Wayland's Smithy. With that idea of existential guilt at the forefront of our sad and sorry minds, regret, all the associated feelings. Obviously, I am in a process. I'm in the midst of mourning on my own account. I'm mourning still the loss of my dad 5 years ago, the loss of my mum a month and a half ago, and 3 weeks ago, our old and dearly beloved Irish wolfhound Gracie. So I'm in that mindset of looking back and wondering at what might have been, mistakes made, opportunities missed, things that will never come again. That's my frame of mind. But I think for the species, anyway, I think that for the longest time, guilt and regret have been a necessary part of what it is and has been to be human and alive. And it's an ancient consideration because, when you get right down to it, the story of humankind is about displacement of the elder by the younger over and over again. And I don't just mean where countries are invaded and one population is replaced by another. I mean earlier iterations of what it has been to be human. Our version of humanity, Homo sapiens, the wise man, so-called, we, one way or another, we displaced on the planet at least the Neanderthals. We at least existed alongside Homo neanderthalensis, and they're not here anymore. But but there's also some thinking that we may have overlapped with some others. There may have been as many as a dozen kinds of human that were genetically distinct to some extent from us, and they're all gone now. For good or ill, we have the planet, and have had for thousands of years, the planet to ourselves. But Homo sapiens, at the very least, arrived in Europe, made their presence felt, might be a more open-minded way of saying it, made their presence, their domineering presence felt in Europe and in the Middle East. Cuckoos in old nests, at a time when Europe and the Middle East were at least populated to some extent by Neanderthals, and they're not here anymore. And for all sorts of reasons, we pushed them out. We're not sure how or why. There's talk of, some people imagine genocidal behaviour, deliberately hunting down and wiping out others. It may just have been the case that we were more fertile, that it was our way, our natural ability to have more children, that we just began to outnumber the incumbent population. But in any event, there was a long process in which the old relatives were pushed out of the prime hunting ground and onto the edges, out into the less desirable territory. I love the idea that the last of them may actually be the explanation for the folk memories in Northern Europe and Scandinavia that can be put under the heading of trolls. There are, when you read into it, there are quite persuasive suggestions that the last of the Neanderthals may have existed out of sight as far as they could, on the edge, living hidden lives in the deep dark woods, in caves, maybe semi-subterranean, who knows, under bridges as it were, and that their presence, before finally diminishing until finally they were gone, they may, those shadows, those lumpen Quasimodos, the rough approximations of men, may be part of what haunts folklore, certainly in Northern Europe. And then, of course, the process went on of an older group losing something because of the advent of someone new. For the longest time, Europe was a hunting ground populated by hunters, and then they, in their turn, were replaced by the farmers. The same species, Homo sapiens, but pushing in from the east or pushing in from the south or whatever, and by force of numbers and whatever other tactics, displacing the hunters that had gone before, until eventually that entire way of life, that hunting way of life, was broadly pushed into oblivion. I mean, or was it? There are so many questions. There are suggestions also that when the farmers came in with their fixed ways of life tied to the land, that they may actually, rather than being absolutely domineering, their lifestyle may have made them slightly vulnerable, because they couldn't go anywhere. They were tied to waiting for their crops to ripen and so on. And actually, you might see here in Britain, what's the classic image of the aristo, the landowner? It's the red-tunicked hunters on horseback with hounds chasing foxes through the farmland. Farmland that's worked by their tenants, but they just gallop through it, high and mighty. So it becomes a question of just exactly who won. Did the farmers win, or did the farmers just accept a kind of submission in the face of maybe the perpetuation of a hunting class that morphed into the landowners? Who knows? But there's always this, we're always haunted by this idea of ways of life that went before that have been pushed to the margins. And it's also true when it comes to being haunted, when it comes to guilt and regret and wondering about what might have been and contemplating prices paid for what we have. It seems that from the earliest times, some of our kind, understood that there was a price to be paid for everything that was taken from the world. Now that's everything. That's animals hunted for food, for their skins and bones and horns and all the rest of it. That there was a price for clearing woodland, felling the old growth forests that had been there forever, burning trees, opening fields. Then, obviously, around the time, certainly in the Neolithic, there were miners in places like Grimes Graves, dropping great shafts into the earth in pursuit of the flint from which they would make their tools. Grimes Graves is Anglo-Saxon. It means something like the diggings of the hooded man. And the hooded man in question might be Odin or someone similar. And because those miners understood that they were taking and that they ought to give, they left offerings of food and little figurines carved from the chalk as gifts in payment for the flint that they were taking from the world below. That idea of a debt accumulating, and they were acknowledging that debt, and then they would backfill the workings. Once they had got what they came for, they would fill the shafts in and leave these slumbering offerings down in the dark. And then in the ages of metal, once flint was supplanted by technologies around copper and then bronze and then iron, items of inestimable value, like a sword. Try and imagine the value in every sense of a sword. The work that had gone into acquiring the raw materials for it, the dependence on the skill and the technology of the smith. It's a sword, it's like a car. It's or an item of jewellery, a golden torque worn around a woman or indeed a man's neck. All of it was priceless. And yet over and over again, these things are put in the river, or thrown into a lake, buried in the ground. And before they're put away from the use of man, they're usually broken, bent in half, whatever, put out of touch, out of the reach of human beings, and offered up to God or the gods, or given back to the earth or the water or other elements. There was this sense of an account somewhere that was being kept of what was owed and what would have to be repaid one way or another. And then at the fundamental level, we are all borrowings from the earth and from our parents' flesh and blood. We are made of something that someone else has given, that someone else has surrendered willingly or unwillingly. And that everything we have in our mortal coil, we only hold it for a while, and then the account comes due. We pay it back. It returns to the earth, or it's cremated and goes into the sky. There's a French anthropologist. I did a bit of anthropology at university and amongst my archaeology degree, and one of the writers that if you read anthropology, you hit Claude Lévi-Strauss, who's a French anthropologist, and controversial at points, and you can agree with him or disagree with him, but something he said that registered with me is that humankind understands that it is born lame and wanting. We come with something missing. We're not complete, and we are imperfect. And that some of us, the more thoughtful, let's say, understand that Mother Earth does not readily surrender the things that we take from her. No one asks her. She just has things taken from her. And all the myths are redolent of the theme. People pay a price for getting what they want. Oedipus, despite all of his desperate best intentions, ended up killing his father and marrying his mother. And when she learned the truth, she killed herself, and Oedipus blinded himself. The price. And to get closer to Wayland's smithy, and think about what a smithy is and who Wayland might have been, the ancient Greeks told each other about Hephaestus, who was the god of the forge. Hephaestus made, in the Greek imagination, the weapons of the heroes, amongst other things. And he was worshipped as the god of all craftsmen, the people who make, the people who forge, the people who take nothing and turn it into something. According to the legend, he was the son of, there's various versions of this. He was the son of Zeus and Hera. They were the king and queens of the Olympian gods. And one day, Hephaestus heard his parents fighting, arguing at least. I don't think it was fisticuffs, but they were arguing about something or other. And Hephaestus stepped in on his mother's behalf, kind of got between his mother and his father. And Zeus lost it and grabbed Hephaestus by one leg and flung him from the summit of Olympus. And Hephaestus's fall back to earth lasted a whole day. And he landed on the island of Lemnos, broken and lame. He was lamed ever after by the fall. The fall. Another version of it has Hephaestus born of Hera without any coupling with Zeus or anybody else, that she just produced him on her own. And for that reason, he mattered less to Zeus than he mattered to Hera, because he was all hers, nothing to do with Zeus. And in fact, that kind of birth in the manner of a plant, really, parthenogenesis, was her revenge against Zeus, because Zeus in his own part, in his own turn, had given birth to Athena, whole and complete, without involving his wife. So it was a tit for tat, which would again explain why Zeus might have had a grudge against Hephaestus. In another version, Hephaestus is actually born lame. He's born with 2 club feet. And because he's imperfect in a world of gods, his mother throws him out Olympus herself. But in any event, Hephaestus is the smith of the gods. And he makes the winged helmet and sandals of Hermes. He makes Achilles' armour. He makes Eros' bow and arrow. But the point is that his skills cost him dearly. He was a magician when it came to his skill, but it came at a terrible price. Again and again, there's gain and there's loss in pursuit of a balance. And where debts are left unsettled, there's guilt at the species level as well as at the individual level. Somewhere along the line, the same stories crop up in different places. Now, either they spread, either there's an original story and it spreads and things get lost and confused in the translation, or similar sounding stories occur spontaneously in different places for ways that maybe it's because they actually address archetypes and something fundamental that people, independent of one another, understand because they're fundamental. But in Northern Europe, there's a story of the smith Wayland, or Wayland, and now we get to it, Wayland the smith. And he's another genius. He can make anything with metal, precious jewels, adornments, weapons, you name it. And amongst others, King Naudud of Sweden covets it. And he sends a team to capture Wayland. And Wayland's brought to the castle, and Wayland is hamstrung. His tendons are cut on one or both of his legs so that he can't escape. Either that or he's sort of chained to the forge so that he can only work and never be set free. So that's the stage set. If you're familiar with the white horses that are dotted around the English landscape, you'll certainly have heard of the White Horse of Uffington. Easily the best of them, easily the most artistically audacious. It's in Oxfordshire, and just a mile from the Uffington White Horse is Wayland's Smithy. Right, that's where we are. And the name Wayland's Smithy is Anglo-Saxon, but thousands of years before their arrival in England, the Neolithic farmers, for it was they, put together a tomb for their dead. And in the way of all tombs, there's a long story. There's always phases. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Archaeological textbooks are full of them. These things develop over protracted periods of time. Sometimes years, sometimes decades, sometimes centuries, even millennia. So sometime around the middle of the 4th millennium, 4,000 years before the birth of Christ, somewhere around that time, there's a timber chamber built. It's really more of a lidded box, like a chest, judging from the archaeological remains and the interpretation thereof. But it was for keeping, holding, storing mortal remains, bones, probably bones from which the flesh and all the rest of the soft tissue had been allowed to go elsewhere, by excarnation, bodies that were laid out somewhere and stripped by the weather and by scavenging animals, and then the sticky bones are gathered up and put somewhere else. And archaeologists excavating the site found that one figure had been laid down, actually intact, not excarnated, put into this box, curled like a baby, a curled inhumation. Always suggestive somehow of an attitude in relation to the dead, of putting the dead in the ground in the posture of a baby, back into the womb of the earth, perhaps in hopes of return. In the vicinity of the box were the bones of 11 men and 2 women and a child, and they had been stacked like lumber, possibly on a raised platform, the same platform upon which bodies may have been traditionally laid out to be picked clean by scavengers and all of the rest of it. There were arrowheads in relation to some of the bones that suggested that perhaps those arrowheads had been in the flesh of the dead when they had flesh, i.e. they may have been victims of some sort of violence, combat, warfare, who knows. At either end of the box, the lidded chest, there were post holes which suggested that there might have been upright timbers supporting a roof. But, as with all archaeological excavations, it's impossible to be absolutely sure about the sequences of events, and in any event, the intentions of the people responsible for the structures. There are unanswerable questions about Wayland Smithy. Were other bodies in the box and then removed and buried elsewhere, or were the human remains found in relation to it the only inhumations that there ever were in relation to the box? Were the 14 individuals found by the archaeologists the only tenants of that place of death? Don't know. Anyway, just a few years later, after that period of time of making use of this wooden box, an oval mound was raised over the whole thing. Ditches either side were dug out, and what was dug out of the ditches was heaped up into this to create this oval mound that buried it in its entirety. So was it being put out of use? Was it being repurposed? And then after that, after the construction of this oval mound, decades perhaps pass, a quiet time, and then people come back, other farmers come back to Wayland Smithy and redesign it. And this time we get to what is the final iteration that's still there today. A stone-built passage was built. It's quite simple, a straight passage, and then with chambers either side. So if you'd looked at it from above, it would have described a cross shape. It's very interesting the way, obviously the pre-Christian world of the Neolithic chambered tombs of Britain and Ireland. So often what you encounter is the shape of a cross, a perfect cross. So that whose idea is the cross? At what point did that shape take on a significance? Because these these cruciform passages way predate crucifixion. So, more questions, always more questions than answers. But in the case of Wayland Smithy, a passage was built, chambers either side, and then a wedge-shaped barrow, kind of a lozenge, narrow at one end, wider at the other, 80 feet long, 40 feet wide at the widest, 20 feet wide at the rear, so you can get a sense of this narrowing shape. But if you've visited Wayland Smithy, what you're struck by, most imposing, most impressive of all, is the facade. On the front of this thing are enormous sarsen slabs, 10 feet high, each of them, placed across the front, like a fantastic backdrop, maybe, for some kind of performance. An amazing scene. And inside the chambers on either side of the passage, were scattered remains of 7 human beings, 7 adults. Again, there were arrowheads involved. Was that the manner of death for some of these people, or were the arrowheads put in as tokens, laid on the dead? It's possible to know. It seems that all of it, from the decision by some or other farmers to create the wooden box, all the way through to what we see now as Wayland Smithy, perhaps was all encompassed within a single century, which in the scheme of things isn't very long. It's suggestive of a continuity of all the people knowing about the place. It's never completely forgotten. They're always aware of it, and they associate the shape with the dead, and so on and so on. All of that is happening within the memory of just a few generations laid end to end. But that's Wayland Smithy. And so, the years then pass, and the time of stone tools and the time of bone tools and wood and antler, they're replaced or added to. I mean, no one stops using stone. It's just augmented by metal making. And during the same period of time, ideas about what to do with the dead changed. And so the tomb remained abandoned. It wasn't being used. It may have been being remembered. It may have been being visited. It would certainly be noticed, but it wasn't in action. And to some extent, it may have just been a hump amongst a steady growth of beech trees, which is what is still there now. Then cue the arrival of the Angles and the Saxons in the 400s AD. That's how long the Anglo-Saxons have been here. That's how long they've been involved in the story here. They come in around the time when the Romans are losing interest in Britain. And some of those Anglo-Saxons came to Oxfordshire, or the territory that we know as Oxfordshire. And if they were coming in from the east, because the Angles and Saxons are making their way into the Long Island of Britain from Northern Europe. They're coming in from that part of Northern Europe facing Scandinavia. So they arrive likely from the east to the west, which is Oxfordshire, via the ancient trackway called the Ridgeway. The Ridgeway is basically just a ridge of high ground from east to west, or west to east. And it's been being walked by human beings for 5,000 years at least, a lot longer. As a path to follow, it would always have attracted people because it's high ground. If you're on foot and you're making your way through a landscape, perhaps a landscape that you've never visited before, you would naturally want to be high up so you can see ahead, make better decisions about, how to get to where you want to go. And you're also maybe less likely to be ambushed by predators or by other people. But in one way or another, the Ridgeway has been a road forever. And it passes right by Uffington White Horse, which is, as far as we can tell, because it's very difficult to put a date on these things, but the Uffington White Horse seems to be the oldest geoglyph. So that's how these things are described, a geoglyph, a picture on the world. It's the oldest in the country. The White Horse is amazing. It was cut into the ridge of the Ridgeway more than 3,000 years ago. And to be honest, it's called a horse, but I think it looks much more like a wolfhound. If you ask me, I don't think it looks as much like a horse as it looks like a running hound. And I would know. But anyway, the consensus is it's a horse. So Uffington White Horse it is. It's a wondrous thing. It's all sinuous movement. It looks like it's moving. It's a fantastic piece of work in terms of artistic brio. Actually, in Terry Pratchett, the late dear departed Terry Pratchett, one of his novels is A Hat Full of Sky, and the heroine of A Hat Full of Sky is Tiffany Aching, and she wears a necklace with the Uffington horse on it, and her dad tells her it's not what a horse looks like, it's what a horse be, which is perfect, because what the Uffington geoglyph encapsulates is everything there is to be a horse, or everything there is to be a galloping animal. It's close to Wayland Smithy, and that may have mattered because both Wayland Smithy and the White Horse long predated the Anglo-Saxons, and when they appeared in the landscape and found both, they may have connected them in their imaginations. It's huge, it's 360 feet long, cut into the chalk. It has actually moved across the landscape because it's only there because there has always been a tradition of recutting it. Otherwise, it would have overgrown, disappeared millennia ago. But in the action of recutting it, it has moved. It's crept inch by inch. So it's not even in its original location. It's kind of in slow motion. It has galloped across the ridge. But when the Anglo-Saxons came in and saw the thing, in proximity to the stones, they may have connected it in some way. They may have connected the horse to ideas of blacksmithing and maybe weapon making, and that would have connected them to the idea of their weapon making god Wayland. And it seems also that the facade that I mentioned of the half dozen gigantic sarsen stones, and then the cramped darkness beyond it, the sort of crawl space passage and chamber beyond, seems to have come together in some way for the Anglo-Saxons, such that they imagined that it had once been home to Wayland and his forge. Archaeologists found ironwork inside, particularly two unshaped bars of iron that might have been blanks for swords. But in any event, folklore, ancient and modern, has always insisted that that place was inhabited by Wayland, the lame smith of the gods. Wayland is mentioned in Beowulf. Have you read Beowulf? Beowulf's great. Old English epic poem. It's about Beowulf, who's a hero, and he comes of his own volition to help a bunch of Danesmen fight a monster that's eating them every night. Grendel, and then Grendel's mother. Beowulf comes to deal with both. And as Beowulf is, preparing to go off to fight, he says, in relation to the mail shirt that he's wearing, part of his armour, he says, "If the battle takes me, send back this breast webbing that Wayland fashioned to Lord Hygelac." So he's name-checking Wayland. And the oldest mention, let's see, there's a consensus that the oldest mention of Wayland's smithy itself, the actual site, is in a document prepared for King Eadred in 955 AD, wherein Wayland's Smithian is noted as a boundary marker between two territories. Surely, whatever, those Anglo-Saxons had no way of understanding what Wayland Smithy really was, well, which is to say, we all think it's a Neolithic chamber tomb. They had no way of knowing that. They wouldn't have been minded to investigate it in that way. But in crawling around inside it, they may have come upon the human remains, and they may have fitted that in somehow to the idea of a broken god, as Wayland was understood to the people of Northern Europe. There's actually a Norse poem that describes the revenge that Wayland took on Nidud, the king of Sweden. He's at his forge, he can't move, but he lures two of the king's sons, young lads, to come to the forge, and he kills them and cuts their heads off, and he makes grisly treasures from their skulls, and he gives them back to the king. Quote, "I smote off the heads of both thy sons. Their skulls, once hid by their hair, I took, set them in silver, and sent them to Nidud. Gems full fair from the eyes fashioned, to Nidud's wife so wise I gave them. And from the teeth of the twain I wrought a brooch, for the breast to Bothvild I gave it." Bothvild was the boy's sister. The past is a mist, a swirling mist of explanations and possibilities. What's that line in Lewis Carroll? Sylvia and Bruno concluded, once a coincidence was taking a walk with a little accident, and they met an explanation, a very old explanation, so old that it was quite doubled up and looked more like a conundrum. So it's all a mist. The older I get, the more I kind of shake off the yoke of orthodoxy and just allow myself to wonder. And if you have that sort of frame of mind, myths of all sorts, they all come together, and it's hard to isolate one from another, and there may not even be any need so to do. So Wayland, for example, seems to have connections to the Greek craftsman and inventor Daedalus, who flees Crete with his son Icarus. And they both have wings designed by Daedalus, and Icarus flies too close to the sun, the wax melts, the feathers come off, and he falls and dies. But Daedalus is also the man who has built the labyrinth beneath the palace at Knossos to hold the monster Minotaur. And it has been suggested that the Anglo-Saxons, who one way or another may have been aware of the legends of Daedalus and Knossos, that they took one look at Wayland Smithy and saw it as another maze. They were minded of Daedalus, another inventor, another craftsman, someone who makes. So Wayland Smithy is haunted by Wayland. But as it happens, his is not a malevolent presence in any way. He's been through some sort of evolution come metamorphosis, and now he helps passers-by. From a time beyond the reach of memory, folklore has had it that if you're riding your horse and it throws a shoe, that if you get as far as Wayland Smithy and leave a coin, if you come back after a day or two or a couple of hours or whatever, he'll have fixed it. He'll have reshod your horse for you. And there was an Oxfordshire antiquarian called Francis Wise who wrote in a letter to one Dr. Mead, published in Concerning Antiquities in Berkshire in 1738, quote, "At this place lived formerly an invisible smith, and if a traveller's horse had lost a shoe upon the road, had no more to do than bring the horse to this place with a piece of money, and leaving both there for some little time, he might come again and find the money gone, but the horse new shod." Walter Scott, in the case of Wayland Smithy, he egregiously traduced the legend and implanted a character called Tressilian, who's a Cornish knight, and Tressilian encounters a strange blacksmith, and the story unfolds, and the blacksmith is no god. He's not supernatural in any way. He's just a man, and he's eking a living by deception. He's got an underground forge, and he's conjured this whole, mysterious presence. Rudyard Kipling, of whom I'm much more instinctively fond, he wrote Puck of Pook Hill. And Puck of Pook Hill is, by his own description, the oldest thing in England. Puck. He's old beyond... He's not older than England, but he's the oldest thing in England. And Puck of Pook Hill he's the embodiment of old England, of what the land once was. And for the sake of it, let's just extend England to the island, right? Let's transcend national boundaries. Quote, "The people of the hills have all left. I saw them come into old England, and I saw them go." The people of the hills. He's ancient. He's the oldest thing in England in his own time. But he's also, he acknowledges that he too is an incomer to England. He watched Stonehenge being built, and Puck of Pook Hill is being narrated to children gathered around him, and the children in question are descendants of all the more recent arrivals. So everyone that's made contact with the British Isles: Phoenicians, Gauls, Angles, Danes, Saxons, Jutes, whatever. And Puck describes how the immigrants brought their own gods, and he describes how England is a bad country for gods, most of whom could not stand our climate. And so Wayland was one of those. But whatever he once was, if he was real, he's been laid low by circumstances, so that by now, rather than a god demanding sacrifices and the rest, he's just scraping by on single coins, in return for shoeing passing nags. In the best traditions of these places, Wayland Smithy is still to be avoided at night, despite the fact that Wayland is a benevolent presence, keen to help. There are reports down through the years of hammering, the ringing of blows struck on the lintel of Wayland Smithy with a hammer made not of earthly metal, but of stone that fell from the moon. Visitors report what is so often reported in these places of import, which is to say oppressive weight, being some sadness settling upon a person. Others claim that they're being watched. They can, that feeling that we're all, when you're being stared at. Sometimes you turn around and you are being stared at. It is a human sense, a sort of a sixth sense. People do know when they're being stared at, even if they can't see the person staring at them. But in the case of Wayland Smithy, invariably people turn around and there's no one there. People crawling inside the tomb, sense not being wanted. And best of all, I think, every 100 years, apparently, the Uffington White Horse gets up and gallops the mile to Wayland Smithy for fresh shoes, which I find a very wholesome thought. And to get back to where I began, I have wondered if it isn't, in the case of Wayland's Smithy and Puck of Pook Hill, old England, old Britain, I wonder if it's that's being mourned, not just at Wayland's Smithy, but all along the Ridgeway and, quite frankly, the length and breadth of the island. We know we've not done right by the place. It's not necessarily the fault of us humble citizens, but we've been here while the powers that ought not to be have undone the place completely. And we know it. Ignorance is no defence. It has happened on our watch. And I think there's a growing guilt. I think there are many people who know that they've witnessed something terrible that has unfolded slowly. And now here we are. In the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, there's an Anglo-French writer and historian who'll be familiar to some. He's got Hilaire Belloc. And he published a book. I've got it up there. I'm very fond of it. It's called The Old Road. And he wrote about the Ridgeway that trails across the west, from west to east or east to west across the south of England. And he saw it as the most important work, the most important and foundational impact that our species has had upon the world. Not the Ridgeway as such, but the road, the way, the marked way, the familiar route from somewhere to elsewhere. He said that other creations of early humanity were profoundly important as well. Quote, "We craved these things," he wrote, "the camp, the refuge, the sentinels in the dark, the hearth. Before we made them, they are part of our human manner, and when this civilization has perished, they will reappear. But when it came to the road, the way, I am the way, the truth and the light, the way," he wrote, quote, "it is the humblest and the most subtle, but the greatest and most original of the spells which we inherit from the earliest pioneers of our race. It was the most imperative and the first of our necessities. It is older than building and than wells. Before we were quite men, we knew it, for the animals still have it today. They seek their food and their drinking places and, as I believe, their assemblies by known tracks, which they have made." Folk still walk the Ridgeway. It's a thing. People do it. It's not intact. It's broken up by modern development and so on. But people sort of stitch the parts together and they walk and they make their way usually from the west, the deep southwest, and they terminate at Canterbury Cathedral. That's kind of generally understood to be the route of the Ridgeway. You pass the White Horse. You pass Wayland Smithy. That landscape where Kipling's Puck lamented the passing of the first settlers of the landscape. The people of the hills have all left. I saw them come into Old England and I saw them go. They are the ghosts. Those departed people of the hills are the ghostly representatives of an old way of life, all the old ways of life, the first ways of life. It's their ghosts, I contend, that walkers on the Ridgeway sense now. Old England, old Britain, has been changed beyond recognition at the very least. The destruction is all about us. The controlled demolition. We know we haven't done right by the place, and we are haunted by the guilt of it. At the end of the Old Road, Hilaire Belloc enters Canterbury Cathedral on the anniversary of the martyrdom of Thomas à Becket, who shall rid me of this troublesome priest and all that. Quote, I had so fixed the date of this journey, the hour and the day were the day and hour of the murder. So Belloc hopes that such an exact coincidence, by deliberately arriving in that location at that time, that it might conspire with the significance of the place to let him glimpse the Archbishop as he had appeared that day of days. Quote, watching the door from the cloister, watching it unbarred at his command. And Belloc thought he might bear witness across the abyss of centuries to a reenactment of the crime. He's got a writer's imagination, hasn't he? Quote, the jangle of arms and of scabbards trailing, the sharp insults, the blows. But of course, he didn't see anything. He just saw an empty church. And, anything else was just the stuff, as he understood it, of his imagination. Quote, there was no such vision. It seems that to an emptiness so utter, not even ghosts can return.